Well, welcome back to Backgrounds of the New Testament. Thank you so much for tracking with us. We are, in today's class, going to be walking right up to the back door of the New Testament time period. So we have a lot of ground to cover historically. And I tend to move back and forth between historical detail and theological development and worldview formation and things like that that took place. Today is going to be largely history, especially as we have so much to cover. However, the history that we're going to be talking about today is the reason why so much theological development takes place during this time period, which we'll take a look at in detail in our next class. But if you remember from our last lesson, we had the Jews had returned back from the Babylonian exile, at least in small part. A small percentage of them were able to go back. They were all allowed to go back, but for various reasons, many did not, whether that was because of the cost of moving back there or just replanting themselves after having settled for such a long time throughout their dispersion, or the fact that when those first Jews that went back to Jerusalem and Judea after the exile found it needing to be completely rebuilt from the ground up, and so much work and time had to be put into rebuilding so that it was a place that was enjoyable to live in. And so these are just some of the challenges that face them. And so there's this sense in which even though the Jews were allowed to return back from exile, they still had this understanding that the exile period was not yet over. Things were not yet the way that they were supposed to be. They were not yet the way that God had promised they would be. And so we see that as we come out of the exile period. We're going to be jumping forward through and looking at some of the other hardships that the Jews faced in an ever-changing world that continued to press itself upon them. And so we're going to begin today by talking about a historical figure that I'm sure that just about everybody who watches this video will be familiar with to some respect, but one who probably you had no idea had any kind of influence over the Jewish people, the land of Israel, and especially over New Testament backgrounds. However, he does in some long-standing ways, as we're going to see. So the first person we're going to talk about today is Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great rose to power after the death of his father, King Philip of Macedon, and he rose to power in 336 BC. If you wonder why they give him the surname the Great, it's because Alexander did amazing things in his lifetime. And so he not only fought against the Persians, who was the empire of the time, but he eventually defeated King Darius of Persia and conquered all of the Persian Empire, taking over every little bit that they had accumulated over the several hundred years of their reign. And then when he had done that, he went even beyond that to expand his empire even further, becoming the largest empire of world history at that point. Alexander died early. He died, again, he rose to power in 336 BC, but Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC at the young age of 32. And I want to talk to you a little bit about Alexander's contribution to the history we're going to look at together today, and then also history that impinges on the Jewish people from the very beginning, and will become more of a force to be reckoned with throughout Jewish history, throughout the entirety of the Second Temple period, and that is the rise of Hellenism. And so Alexander the Great, of course, as he's coming with his armies, he's coming to defeat his enemies, he's coming to expand his territory of his empire, but he didn't just stop with conquering. Instead, he loved his Greek culture, his Greek heritage, and all of the things that went along with that. And so he wanted to impart that, bring that throughout the entirety of his empire. And so we see the rise of Hellenization, the spread of Greek culture, Greek philosophy, Greek literature, a Greek language, a Greek worldview to all of the city-states, all of the people groups that were under the reign of Alexander and subsequent generations of Greek kings. So I want to just share with you a quote. This is from J. Julius Scott. He's a professor at Wheaton College. And here's what he has written in terms of this rise of Hellenization that first began to expand from Greece to the regions beyond under Alexander's conquest. Here's what he says. The conquests of Alexander the Great changed the world. The Jewish community was not accepted. The most sweeping part of that change was not political, but cultural. Alexander deliberately set out to spread Greek culture. His army was accompanied by city planners and architects, literary figures and philosophers, biologists and botanists, musicians and actors, and other purveyors of culture. The infusion of Hellenistic culture into the broader world was his greatest legacy. That's an impressive comment when you think about all that Alexander was able to accomplish in such a short time. But what we're going to soon see is that after the death of Alexander the Great, this great empire he had built did not hold together, at least in the way in which he had formed it. But the lasting impact of Alexander the Great was Hellenization, the spread of this Greek culture, Greek language throughout the entire region. And so you got to imagine that while all of these different people groups, of course, did have their own histories, their own ways, their own cultures, their own worldviews, there were some positive sides to the spread of Hellenization. First of all, the Greeks had a lot and had contributed a lot that other cultures were envious of. But not only that, as the world began to get smaller in the sense that they all found themselves under the umbrella of this larger empire, now they had things that were in common with people groups that perhaps they didn't have as much in common with before. And so all of a sudden, there was a universal language that was being spoken to a large degree throughout the empire, the Greek language. There were new mediums of dialogue in the sense of these various schools of philosophy which were being now taught and expanded and embraced throughout the empire. And now all of a sudden you have philosophical discourse taking place from people of various backgrounds. And so in many ways, the spread of Hellenization gave a commonality to the various different people groups under the empire, and it was largely seen as a good thing, as a positive thing for the various people groups in which it affected. The problem is it wasn't so for the Jewish people, because Hellenization was a major threat to the way in which God had called them, the Jewish people, to live. And so on the one hand, we had this universality of Hellenism, and on the other hand, we had this strange dissenting group of people who wanted to hold on to their own distinctives and not be a part of this larger culture, at least in vast ways, as the other people groups around the world. And so as you can imagine, this became a source of distrust among the Jews, between them and the other people groups, and throughout their history, their distinctiveness from the culture is what causes, or at least lends itself to, a lot of the animosity, a lot of the hatred that other people groups had against the Jewish people. And so throughout the Second Temple period, there were areas in Israel that gave in to Hellenism. Some areas such as regions of the Galilee, Samaria, and the Transjordan. And yet other areas within Israel held out to their ancestral ways a little more faithfully, for instance, in Jerusalem and some other areas. Larry Hellier, retired professor of biblical studies at Taylor University, has said this. He said, "The encounter with Hellenism prompted differing responses by the Jewish people. Some resisted this alien pagan system mightily and sought to build a hedge against its influence. Others embraced it fervently as an escape from outdated traditions that were out of touch with the times. Still others adopted a middle road. They absorbed some aspects of Hellenism and adapted others without abandoning the essentials of their Hebraic heritage. Probably a majority of the Jews followed this third way." And so in Hellier's estimation of what took place, you had typically three groups of people. You had those who said, we want no part of this Hellenistic culture. We do not want the Greek ways. We want to hold fast to what God has imparted to us in the Torah. We want to hold fast to our ancestral ways, our ancestral language, our ancestral culture. Then you had, on the other end of the spectrum, this group that thought that their own ways were outdated, were excited by what the Greeks had to offer, and gave themselves fully to adopting this Hellenization of their area and letting it rewrite the way in which they viewed the world. And so you had these two opposite ends of the spectrum. However, what Hellier's saying is that the majority of the Jews took a middle road, if you will. And in that middle road, they held on the foundation of Torah. They continued to be faithful to God, but they took the good aspects, if you will, of the Hellenistic culture and left the bad. And so there was some integration of language and culture and thinking of the Greek way of life into the Jewish way of life, while still holding fast to Torah and things like that. In fact, we have a lot of examples from Second Temple Jewish literature of both Jews who are faithful, but who also embrace some of the ways of Greek thinking. I'll give you an example here from a Second Temple Jewish manuscript called the Letter of Aristeus. And here's I'm just going to go ahead and read it, and then I'll make a few comments about it. Here's what it says. On the next day, the same arrangement was made. And when the king deemed it an appropriate time to ask guests questions, he asked the first of those left over for subsequent questioning, "What is the highest form of sovereignty?" He replied, "Control of oneself and not being carried away by one's impulses." He said that it was quite natural for all men to incline their thoughts in one direction or another. The majority are likely to incline toward things to eat and drink and pleasure, but kings toward territorial conquest, depending on the greatness of their standing. And yet in everyone, moderation is a good thing. What therefore God gives you, take and keep. Do not covet the unattainable. The king was pleased with this reply. I guess I probably should have set this passage up for you, but here's what was happening. So here, this is an Egyptian king who has invited several Jews to come to his palace because he was hoping that they might translate the Torah from Hebrew into Greek, which was the language of the day, so that it could be in the libraries with all the other books of wisdom that the king coveted. And so this group of Jews went and did that. And so they're at the palace as the king's guest. They're there for that task, but as he's wining and dining them in his palace, he's interviewing them to see their level of wisdom. And clearly this king values wisdom. And when we talk about wisdom, we're talking much the philosophical way of thinking that's part of the Greek culture that has come and expanded throughout this area. So he's asking these Jewish people these questions, and their answers, one after the other, are very much rooted in Torah. They're things that wouldn't necessarily go against Torah. At the heart of their response, there's something that you could correlate to something in the law. And yet the way in which they're speaking this is a way in which would have been palatable to those who were seeking human wisdom, human philosophy. And so again, this is one example of that middle road that held fast to Torah, but also embraced the ways of the Greeks. Likewise, in the Apocryphal book, 4th Maccabees, it begins with these words. He says, "The subject that I am about to discuss is most philosophical. That is, whether devout reason is sovereign over the emotions." And so in this particular work of 4th Maccabees, he's laying it right out at the beginning, that he is taking historical events and using them as a philosophical treatise. He's making an argument that while these various philosophical schools rightly understand the importance of wisdom and reason, he's saying that wisdom and reason is not enough apart from a mind that has been informed by God's law. It's only by a reason informed and subject to God's law that one can actually live the life that those in that world aspired to. And so again, we see several works of this kind from these from this time period. So how does the rise of Hellenism impact our understanding of the New Testament? There are several ways, and I'll mention just a few of them briefly. First of all, in Jesus' day, there was a diversity of thought and culture among the Jewish people as it pertains to Hellenism. And so this question again of where do they fall on that spectrum between rejecting it, embracing it fully, and finding somewhere in the middle, we see this conflict or this struggle going on even in the times of Jesus as represented in the Gospels and in Acts. So for instance, in Acts chapter 6, we're introduced to a conflict within the early church between two different types of Jewish believers. There's the Hebraic Jews and the Hellenistic Jews. And so the difference between these two groups is, are they more, have they spent their Jewish lives attached more closely to their ancestral ways, or have they given in more toward the Hellenistic culture? And so what we see in this conflict in Acts chapter 6 is a microcosm of the larger conflict that's going on among Jewish people from both sides of that spectrum. So even in the New Testament, we see evidence of this tension when it comes to Hellenism. Second, there was a diversity in biblical interpretation as a result of the influence of Greek thought. As an example, the Jewish philosopher Philo, who was a contemporary of Jesus but was living in Alexandria, Egypt, he adopted a highly allegorical biblical interpretation. And so an allegorical interpretation, instead of looking at the literal meaning of the text or what's taking place, is looking for a spiritual or deeper meaning in the text that sometimes you could look at the text and, how did you get that? But they're pulling an allegorical meaning of the text and not looking at it for its literal features. And this was part and parcel with the way in which the Greeks would look at various different texts, whether they be historical or poetic or otherwise. And so we see the influence even on how Jewish people interpreted Scripture, again, based on their influence by Hellenization. Third, we even see Paul's awareness and understanding of the various streams of Greek philosophy that were prominent in his day. For instance, he contrasts his ministry with the sophists in Corinth in 1 Corinthians 2. He also quotes a Greek poet, Menander, in that same letter to the church at Corinth. And we see in Acts 17 that he engages with philosophers in Athens, demonstrating a deep awareness both of their beliefs and of their culture. And so again, we see that even Paul, who may not have been a Hellenized Jew, was still very aware of the Hellenistic culture and their various beliefs in the culture around that. And Jesus himself would have grown up very near to a very Hellenized city in Galilee called Sepphoris. And so if Jesus and his father Joseph were artisans, whether they be carpenters or stonemasons, etc., depending on what that word for Joseph's trade was, most likely they would have gone where the business was. And Sepphoris, being such a small distance from Nazareth, and yet being a big city, they probably would have worked or at least been engaged with Jews who were very Hellenized. And so this was always a part of the world of the people we read about in the New Testament, Jesus included. And so these realities confronted Jesus and confronted his followers throughout their ministries. His parables, his illustrations, the things he challenged, the various topics that he taught on, they're all aimed at people and ideas that faced Israel in the first century. And this would have been part of that backdrop of that time. But again, I told you that today we weren't going to spend a lot of time on the worldview formation and the theological development, but that was an important one. And again, during Alexander's time, the giving over to Hellenization was largely optional. It was being taught as Alexander was moving on. But things happened in history that made this choice of how much to engage in Hellenization no longer a choice, but a crossroads, where the Jews had to make a decision to either risk the consequences of not giving themselves over to it, or abandoning their ancestral ways and giving over to it completely. And we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. But let me give you a little bit of a timeline here. Again, the timeline is on your screen right now, and you see that, again, Alexander rose to power in 336 BC, and just a short while later, he died in 323 BC, again at the age of 32. And when he died, everything kind of fell apart in terms of his kingdom, his empire. According to the book of 1 Maccabees, Alexander had divided his kingdom among his generals. But history kind of shows us something a little different. It doesn't show a nice succession. It doesn't show a good plan in place. Instead, what it shows is a power grab among his generals. And so as they sought to reclaim and hold on to pieces of Alexander's empire for themselves, there's four regions, four generals, if you will, who took over parts of Alexander's empire. And we're going to talk about two of them specifically because they're the two that have to do with the geographical region we're talking about and the history that we're looking at together. And so those two areas, or those two kingdoms, if you will, each that had a piece of Alexander's empire, was the Ptolemaic kingdom or empire and the Seleucid Empire. Now again, both of these are Greek people groups, Greek kingdoms with Greek kings. But they were warring against each other through this whole period here over how much they would hold on to themselves after the passing of Alexander. And so the first one to become relevant to Judea, the land of Israel that we're talking about, is the Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic Empire. So they were based out of Alexandria, Egypt. That's their capital of their empire, if you will. But again, they wanted to expand their territory and hold as much of the kingdom for themselves. And so they came back over to Judea and very shrewdly attacked Jerusalem on the Sabbath day when the Jews were unable and unwilling to fight because of the Sabbath. And so they took over that region. And from our sources, the majority of the time under the Ptolemaic Empire was a fairly peaceful one. There were some interesting events, some times of persecution, and you could read about that through various Second Temple Jewish literature. But altogether, from 305 to 198 BC, it was rather uneventful, at least in comparison to what we're going to take a look at under the next empire that has control of the region. So again, there's a conflict between the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire, both generations, descendants from the generals of Alexander that fought to control different pieces of his empire, and they particularly were warring against each other. And right in the middle of their conflict is the land of Judea, currently occupied by the Ptolemies. And so as the Seleucids won victories over the Ptolemaic Empire, they gained control of Judea in 198 BC. And so we had a couple Seleucid kings, but there's one that's particularly noteworthy. One that has been identified by Bible scholars and pastors and others as potentially the figure of some of Daniel's prophecies. Ones that a person who is remembered in not such a good way as Jews even celebrate Hanukkah in our day today. A man by the name of Antiochus IV, who gave himself the name Antiochus Epiphanes. And so Antiochus Epiphanes rose to power in 175 BC over the Seleucid Empire, who had dominion over Judea at the time. Now, Antiochus IV was a ruthless king, and there were two influences behind what could only be called a terrible oppression of the Jewish people. The first is this, that as Antiochus IV continued to battle against the Ptolemaic Empire and his other foes, and needed to rule his area well, there was this distinctive people that held themselves apart from the Greek culture, the Greek world, and the aims of the king as he's trying to rule his empire. And so Antiochus figured if everybody was Greek, if everybody gave up their distinctives and followed along with our culture, our language, our beliefs, that which is important to us, if we were all essentially Greek, then it would be easier to rule all the people under his empire, under his kingdom. And so he made a command that everybody would have to do that they would give up their distinctive ways and worship the Greek gods and essentially give in to this process of Hellenization. The other thing that contributed at this time was, again, that at this point, Hellenization had been an enticing option to many. If you remember what Larry Hellier said about the three groups of Jews, there were those that had given themselves to Hellenization. They had given up their ancestral ways. They had looked at what they believed as largely outdated and loved the culture of the Greeks and had given themselves to it. And these individuals were welcoming the king. In fact, they wanted more of Greek culture. They wanted a Greek gymnasium and other attributes of Greek culture and Greek society to be a part of their land in Judea. And so they were welcoming Antiochus and asking him to get involved more in their region. So between these two things and whatever other crazy ideas were going through Antiochus's mind, oppression began to break out against the Jewish people who refused to comply and give in to Hellenization. In fact, we read in 1 Maccabees Chapter 1, verses 41 through 64, this account. It says, "Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances." He added, "Whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die." In such words he wrote to his whole kingdom. He appointed inspectors over all the people and commanded the towns of Judah to offer sacrifice, town by town. Many of the people, everyone who forsook the law, joined them, and they did evil in the land. They drove Israel into hiding in every place of refuge they had. Now on the 15th day of Kislev, in the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah and offered incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. The books of the law that they found they tore to pieces and burnt with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant or anyone who adhered to the law was condemned to death by decree of the king. They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of burnt offering. According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and their families and those who circumcised them. And they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food or to profane the holy covenant, and they did die. Very great wrath came upon Israel. And so we see a terrible time for those Jews who were trying to remain faithful to God even amidst the growing momentum behind Hellenization. Now you had this foreign Greek king who was imposing his will on the people and sending inspectors town by town to make sure that people were not reading the Torah, that people were not participating in the cultic rites, the sacrificial system in the temple, were making sure that mothers were not circumcising their young boys according to the covenant that God had made with their people for every generation since the beginning. And so over and over again, they're having to make a decision to either disobey God and turn their back on him and be good with the king, or to say no, and when they were faced with death. And so, as you can imagine, this kind of oppression brought revolt. And revolt came specifically through a particular family called the Hasmonean Family. Perhaps you've heard them referred to as the Maccabees. If you ever read the Hanukkah story, it involves this family, and they're standing up to the Greek king Antiochus IV and raising the people up in revolt. And so the story that introduces us to this family is also found in 1 Maccabees Chapter 2. And here's what's happening. Just as we've read earlier from chapter 1, the king has sent inspectors town by town. And so one of them came to a town called Modane, where Mattathias and his sons and his brothers were priests in this town. And this messenger of the king came, established an altar to sacrifice to an idol, and invited Mattathias to be the first to come and sacrifice to this idol. And he'd be a friend to the king, and the king would bless them if they would only turn against God, turn away from their ancestral ways, and embrace the Greek mythology, the Greek deities. And Mattathias refused to do it. And while he's refusing to do it, here comes another Jewish person to go and make sacrifice to this idol. And Mattathias burns with rage. He kills this fellow Jewish person on the altar, then kills the messenger from the king and tears down the altar. And he rallies the faithful Jews in Modane to himself, and they go off, leaving all their possessions behind. And as they go town by town, they're rallying more and more faithful Jews to their cause to fight against Antiochus IV and his armies. And so pretty exciting history we read in 1 Maccabees as we take a look at this history. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the objectives of this small militia that was growing over time, of course, to fight against the Greeks. They had very specific objectives. Let me share just some of them with you. So first, they were, of course, rallying faithful Jews to their cause, because you're not going to fight a king or an emperor, if you will, with armies at his disposal with just a small group, a small militia. And so everywhere they went, they were trying to recruit more and more and more to their cause. They were also forcing faithfulness to the Torah among the Jews. Now again, there were those who had completely given in to Hellenization. There were those who were faithful. And then there were that middle group, those people who didn't want to die. And so they would abstain from circumcision and sacrifices and those things that God had commanded them for fear of death. And here, this group came in and forced faithfulness, even so far as to take children, boys that had not been circumcised, and to force their circumcision and things such as that. Their fellow Jewish people who had given themselves to Hellenism and had aligned themselves with Antiochus IV, this group killed. They took care of those who had given themselves to Hellenism and Antiochus. And their objective was to war against Antiochus in the hopes of expelling him and his armies and his ways from the land of Israel, specifically the capital city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is where the temple of God was. And as we read earlier in 1 Maccabees Chapter 1, Antiochus had not only stopped the sacrifices made to God as he's prescribed in the law, but also set up an altar to Zeus, sacrificed pigs, which are unclean animals, and other abhorrent things done in the temple to render it unclean and unable to perform the sacrifices that God commands. And so the objective of this group, which they did eventually succeed in, was to recapture Jerusalem, reclaim the temple, cleanse it, and again restore the sacrificial system as God had commanded it. And so I want to just talk to you a little bit about this family, the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, if you will. And so, of course, there was Mattathias. But when Mattathias died, his son Judas took over. Judas was not the oldest of his sons, but actually the third oldest of his sons. But he was a fighter. In fact, Maccabeus was not his last name. Maccabeus was a nickname given to him that means hammer or mallet, and demonstrates just how effective he was in fighting. And so, of course, the books of Maccabees and reference to this family as the Maccabees stems from his nickname, this nickname for Judas. You know what? Before we go into the line of the Hasmoneans, let me talk to you in light of what we know so far about Antiochus IV, some theological development that began to start solidifying, if you will, or growing at this particular time. We see actually examples of this in the second book of Maccabees, which was written a little while later, focuses on some different themes, but introduces us to some of the martyrs of Antiochus. And I want to talk to you about two particular aspects that we see in 2 Maccabees chapters 6 and 7. The first one is a more nuanced understanding of God's discipline. Now, if you remember from what we've seen thus far, the Jews are no strangers to God's discipline. In fact, we saw even when we were taking a look at that time in the Babylonian exile, the prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Jews, there was this recognition, this understanding that the Jews were in exile because of their sin and God's righteous judgment. God hasn't done wrong. And so even there, we have the beginning of this theological understanding of how to interpret the hardships that they faced. When we come to 2 Maccabees, we see a little more nuanced or a little more developed understanding as it relates to these events that we read about during the time of Antiochus IV and his oppression of the Jewish people. So I want to read to you just a few verses. This is from 2 Maccabees chapter 6, starting in verse 12. It says, "Now I urge those who read this book not to be depressed by such calamities, but to recognize that these punishments were designed not to destroy, but to discipline our people. In fact, it is a sign of great kindness not to let the impious alone for long, but to punish them immediately. For in the case of the other nations, the Lord waits patiently to punish them until they have reached the full measure of their sins. But he does not deal in this way with us, in order that he might not take vengeance on us afterward when our sins have reached their height. Therefore he never withdraws his mercy from us. Although he disciplines us with calamities, he does not forsake his own people." And so what we see here is the author of 2 Maccabees is saying, listen, we're telling you about a whole bunch of horrible things that happened to our people during this time. But we don't want you to be depressed about this as if this was some horrible tragedy that had no positive end. Instead, this was not for nothing. This was not in vain. Because God brought these calamities on us because of our sin, and he did it by his mercy, so that as we veered away from him, the calamities might remind us that we need him and force our faithfulness and we come back, lest we go so far as to be lost forever. And so unlike the other nations that oppose God forever and ultimately will experience judgment, by his mercy, God disciplines us so that we remain or come back to him quickly and we don't have to face that future judgment. So again, a very similar theme to what we've seen earlier during the exilic period, and yet certainly more developed in their understanding of God's involvement in the calamities that they face. There's other theological things that were starting to develop as a result of the oppression under Antiochus IV that they began to see. And they play into martyrdom and faithfulness to the Torah, even when it means costing you your life. in going to your death willingly as an example, as a model for the nation, for the younger generations, and even this understanding that this life is not all that there is, but rather we would rather have a good life and go to our death so that when we meet God and are judged, we have a positive and eternal life as a result. And so all of these begin to come in more development through Second Temple Jewish literature that is based on this time period. We see it really evident in Fourth Maccabees, which is a little bit later work, but we even see these things in Second Maccabees. And I want to read to you just a small part of two examples of martyrs during this time period. Now, did things happen exactly as we read about them here in 2 Maccabees? We have good reason to believe that there's some truth to these. Again, this is not scripture, but historical literature. But these two examples are often repeated over and over again and held up as great examples for the people. The first is an elderly man by the name of Eleazar. And the second is a story of a mother and her 7 sons. I want to read to you the story of Eleazar, and then I'm just going to summarize the story of the mother and the 7 sons. But here's the example from Eleazar's life. This is from 2 Maccabees Chapter 6, verses 18 and following. Eleazar, one of the scribes in high position, a man now advanced in age and of noble presence, was being forced to open his mouth to eat swine's flesh. But he, welcoming death with honor rather than life with pollution, went up to the rack of his own accord, spitting out the flesh, as all ought to as all ought to go who have the courage to refuse things that it is not right to taste, even for the natural love of life. Those who were in charge of that unlawful sacrifice took the man aside because of their long acquaintance with him, and privately urged him to bring meat of his own providing, proper for him to use, and to pretend that he was eating the flesh of the sacrificial meal that had been commanded by the king, so that by doing this he might be saved from death, and be treated kindly on account of his old friendship with them. By making a high resolve, worthy of his years and the dignity of his old age, and the gray hairs that he had reached with distinction, and his excellent life even from childhood. And moreover, according to the holy God-given law, he declared himself quickly, telling them to send him to Hades. Such pretense is not worthy of our time of life, he said. For many of the young might suppose that Eleazar in his 90th year had gone over to an alien religion, and through my pretense, for the sake of living a brief moment longer, they'd be led astray because of me, while I defile and disgrace my old age. Even if for the present I would avoid the punishment of mortals, yet whether I live or die, I will not escape the hands of the Almighty. Therefore, by bravely giving up my life now, I will show myself worthy of my old age, and leave to the young a noble example of how to die a good death, willingly and nobly, for the revered and holy laws. When he had said this, he went at once to the rack. Those who a little before had acted toward him with goodwill now changed to ill will, because the words he had uttered were in their opinion sheer madness. When he was about to die under the blows, he groaned aloud and said, "It is clear to the Lord and his holy knowledge that though I might have been saved from death, I am enduring terrible sufferings in my body under this beating, but in my soul I am glad to suffer these things because I fear him." So in this way he died, leaving in his death an example of nobility and a memorial of courage, not only to the young, but to the great body of his nation. And so here you have the bold martyrdom of Eleazar, who, having the opportunity even not to sin, but to pretend to sin and save his life, was unwilling to do so for a number of factors. Number one, he still saw it as sin. He still saw it as disobedience to God. And so he was not going to do that because he knew he needed to stand before God rightly. But not only that, he was compelled to set a proper example for the young and for the rest of his nation, that they would follow along in his faithfulness to the Torah, his faithfulness to God, and not give in even under oppression of Antiochus IV. The other example I'm not going to read, but I will summarize briefly, it is just as stirring, is the story of a mother and her 7 sons. And they were offered the same opportunity as Eleazar to eat the food that was prohibited under the law. and to be blessed, or to face torture and death. And one after the other, the brothers exhorted each other to remain faithful, went willingly to their death until their mother was left, having watched all of them die before her, and then she willingly leapt to her death, lest they molest her, or that she would be touched by a Greek person, and so she too went willingly to her death in order to not go against God and His law. And so these are examples that are held up over and over and over again in Jewish history in terms of what it means to remain faithful even under persecution, even under oppression. There's never a good excuse to disdain God and His law, but remain faithful. And believe me, that these examples were held up in later times as well. Well, let's talk about this Hasmonean line, because as you can imagine, or as you probably know from history, they were eventually successful in overcoming Antiochus IV and the Seleucid Empire. So let me go back to our timeline briefly here and talk to you about this line of the Hasmoneans who would lead the Jewish people right up to just a short time before the New Testament time. And so, of course, the first in the Hasmonean line, the one who began the revolt, was Mattathias. He didn't live long after the beginning of this period of revolt, but when he died, his son, Judas, the one called Maccabees, stepped up and led the people and continued the pursuits that his father had begun. And he led from 167 BC until his death in 161 BC. When he died, his brother Jonathan took over and continued to lead the people. And so what had been largely guerrilla forces under Mattathias and Judas were now formed into a powerful army under Jonathan, who was viewed as both the high priest and the leader. And so he led from 161 to 143. Backing up to Judas one moment, one of the things that he is absolutely noteworthy for is while he was still alive and leading the charge, they were the faithful Jews who were revolting against Antiochus IV were able to recapture Jerusalem and cleanse the temple. And so that story that's told every year at Hanukkah time of the cleansing of the temple, that took place under Judas Maccabeus. But again, his brother Jonathan took over after his death and formed the people into a powerful army. His brother Simon took over after his death, leading from 143 to 135 BC, and they were able to win the fight against Antiochus IV, and were able to claim a brief independence. And a couple words about that, but first let me read to you just two verses that kind of summarize and celebrate this from 1 Maccabees. This is 1 Maccabees Chapter 13, verses 41 to 42. It says, "In the 170th year, the yoke of the Gentiles was removed from Israel, and the people began to write in their documents and contracts in the first year of Simon, the great high priest and commander and leader of the Jews." And so they recognized and celebrated their independence from the Seleucid Empire, from the reign of these kings. And so we see that in that time period under Simon. And so even though independence was briefly acquired, though, there was never peace. And so this is the important thing. They didn't end the Seleucid Empire. They just ended the Seleucid Empire's reign over Judea. And so there continued to be strife with them and other areas that had aligned themselves with the Seleucids, who had seen opportunity to take advantage of these remote towns in Judea. And so there continued to be conflict all throughout the Jewish history, but we do still celebrate that brief independence, even if only for 71 years. The Jews continued again to have conflict during this time. After Simon, you see the next generation of the Hasmonean Empire. We have, or the Hasmoneans, we have John Hyrcanus, ruling from 135 to 104 BC. And his reign was marked by territorial expansion. And so here they not only have their freedom, but they're looking now to expand their own rule And there was also forced conversions during this time period. That's something that we don't often think about in Jewish history. In fact, it's not marked by most of Jewish history. This is not something that God ever commanded in the Old Testament. But under John Hyrcanus, there was territorial expansion and forced conversion to Judaism. One of the areas that received this domination and forced conversion was Idumea. And so that is important and relevant to our backgrounds of the New Testament, because Herod the Great and his family were in Idumea, and so they converted to Judaism by force under the reign of John Hyrcanus. So here we have the first 5 leaders of the Hasmoneans. And again, what kind of signifies their purpose was fighting against Hellenization, fighting for freedom for the Jewish people, and again, having a Jewish nation. Sadly, even as their line continued for a few more generations, we see not only a breakdown of this, but we see actually a reversal back to the things that they initially were even fighting against. And this is heartbreaking when we look at this. And so after John Hyrcanus, we see Aristobulus the First. And this man was distinctly different from those who had gone before him. As you can see, he only ruled for 1 year, and yet even in that 1 year, he was not content with being the leader of the Jewish people, but he sought to be named king. His predecessors had fought against Hellenization and fought to return to the Torah, and yet here Aristobulus the First, the Hasmonean king, embraced Hellenism fully. The very thing, again, that his predecessors warned against, he embraced. He was even known for having starved his mother to death in prison and having his brother executed in his pursuit of monarchy. After him ruled Alexander Jannaeus from 103 to 76 BC. He continued territorial expansion. In fact, one of the notable things about this territorial expansion was that he achieved a Jewish kingdom that was as large as the kingdom possessed by David and Solomon in their day. And yet under his rule, civil war broke out, and he's known for having sided with the Sadducees over the Pharisees. In fact, he had 800 Pharisees crucified and their wives and children killed in front of them as they were dying. So terrible, terrible history we see coming from this Hasmonean line in later generations. Queen Alexandra from 76 to 67 BC. She was the wife of Alexander Jannaeus, and after his death, she was the sole ruler over Judea. She switched her allegiance from the Pharisees over to the Sadducees, and here's what switched her allegiance to the Pharisees over the Sadducees. And so here's what Josephus, the Jewish historian, writes about it. He says, "Beside Alexandra, and growing as she grew, arose the Pharisees, a body of Jews with the reputation of excelling the rest of their nation in the observances of religion, and as exact exponents of the laws. To them, being herself intensely religious, she listened with too great deference, while they, gradually taking advantage of an ingenuous woman, became at length the real administrators of the state, at liberty to banish and to recall, to loose and to bind whom they would. In short, the enjoyments of royal authority were theirs. But if she ruled the nation, the Pharisees ruled her." So we see that the Pharisees rose to power and took quite advantage of it under Queen Alexandra's reign. In fact, this was the tipping point. This was the turning point that established the Pharisees throughout the land of Israel. We see even in the New Testament Gospels just how expansive the Pharisees were. I mean, everywhere Jesus traveled to, whether in the Galilee or even down to Jerusalem, Pharisees were everywhere. And so this would have been the point where they kind of rose to prominence, even though we still see the Sadducees in their role in Jerusalem, on the Sanhedrin, and at the temple in Jerusalem. After Queen Alexandra we have probably the most tragic instance in the history of the Hasmonean line, and that is a conflict between two brothers, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II, between the years of 67 and 64 BC. So Queen Alexandra out of her two sons, named Hyrcanus II as high priest and regent. He was the one to take over and to rule after his mother. And Aristobulus led a coup. His brother led a coup and took over the leadership of Judea. And so conflict continued to ensue between these two brothers and their supporters. And so Aristobulus had established himself, had taken over rule of Judea, and his brother had fled. And then the supporters of Hyrcanus II rallied to his cause to try to find other nations to align with who would help him in reestablishing his throne. And to make a long story short, they both ended up meeting and pleading their case before Pompey the Great of Rome. And Pompey sided with Hyrcanus, and Aristobulus did not back down. And so Aristobulus was captured by Pompey. And even so, as Hyrcanus now had Rome's blessing to go and be king over Judea, you had the supporters of Aristobulus II who had camped out in the city of Jerusalem and were not willing to give it up. And so Pompey, at the head of a Roman army, went and laid siege to the city. The supporters of Aristobulus II had holed themselves up in the temple of God. And so Pompey and his army laid siege to the temple, broke down a wall into the temple, marched in, and killed all of them, and established Hyrcanus II as king. But here we have a full reversal in the line of the Hasmoneans, because what Mattathias and his sons set out to do, to win Jewish independence from these foreign kings, and succeeded in doing, now all of a sudden is completely reversed just a few generations later by their descendants. Because by seeking Pompey's help, by reaching out to Rome to resolve this conflict between two Jewish brothers, now, yes, we have a king, a Hasmonean king in Jerusalem. However, he is now a client king of Rome, and Judea is now a tributary to Rome. So that means money is paid to Rome, men are sent off to fight Roman wars, and ultimately they are now again under a foreign power, under the Roman Empire. So if you ever wondered why at the end of the Old Testament we see the Persian Empire is in charge, then you flip over to the New Testament in Matthew chapter 1, and here are the Romans. We miss this entire history of this fight for Jewish independence from oppressive nations, the winning of this victory of independence, and then handing it right back to another foreign power who would again be oppressive in many ways. And so we're going to take a look at some of the history as we explore Rome and their influence on the Jews of the time and the formation of the New Testament the next time we get together. Thanks for tuning in.